Hi everyone, I'm Jo Fry and this is my channel, Jojo Fry Rocks, and in this video I'm just going to talk a little bit about something that I feel is generally missing from all of those guitar reviews, guitar shootouts, any video on guitar YouTube where someone's talking through the features of a particular guitar and giving them scores and ratings. I think that one of the things that is generally kind of mixed is how easy or difficult it is once you've bought a guitar to actually own and maintain that guitar. Now, I think the reason behind this is because generally the audience on guitar YouTube, particularly for guitar reviews, I think, tend to be people who've been playing for a long time, people who've got a lot of experience and probably a fair bit of knowledge about guitars and about how to look after them and how to maintain them. And indeed, there are a lot of you out there who are practically luthiers, or not luthiers, but I mean practically guitar techs then. I see a lot of people, viewers in the comments who talk about different modifications or mods that they've done to various guitars that they've owned. So, there are a lot of you out there who are really skilled and knowledgeable and you know exactly what you're doing, and there's maybe nothing particularly challenging about owning and maintaining different types of guitars. But I think if we want to be truly inclusive as a community, we need to kind of include beginners who could be at any age or at any level, perhaps looking to buy their first guitar. Could be parents out there buying guitars for their children who are starting to learn to play guitar, sort of, who might not have any knowledge about guitar maintenance themselves. There are some really super basic things that anyone who buys any kind of guitar needs to know how to do and be able to do. And also, I think we should be kind of giving a score or a rating to how easy or difficult those things are to do yourself with little to no knowledge of guitars. So, the first thing that I think we need to give a rating to, maybe just out of 5, let's say, 5 being hardest, 1 being easiest, is how easy or difficult is it to change the strings? Because changing the strings is something that is a fundamental task in owning a guitar. At some point in that guitar's life, you will need to change the strings, depending on how often you play it. I think 30 to 40 hours is what I've sort of researched in terms of, how frequently you need to change the strings. So after kind of 30 to 40 hours of play, that could be over any amount of time. However, there are all sorts of other environmental factors which mean that even if you haven't done 30 or 40 hours of playing, just the strings being, if the guitars are out of the case, and they're just kind of in an environment where they might oxidize, even if you don't play very often, I'd say probably change your strings once a year. Even if you've only done a few hours of practice over the whole year, it's still worth giving them a change. So, with that in mind, if you've got to do that at least once a year, and if you play a lot, maybe you want to do that at least once a month, depending on how much you play. ease or difficulty of changing strings is actually a massive factor to consider when you're thinking about buying a new guitar. It's certainly something that I did not consider when I fell in love with my Ibanez RG550 when I was 18, and I asked for that as my 18th birthday present from my parents. I had no idea about what owning a guitar with a Floyd Rose was going to involve. So a lot of that is a factor of the type of bridge setup that you've got and whether or not there's a tremolo unit of some kind. So that's point number one. Point number two, once you've changed the strings, so let's say you want to change the string gauge, for example, then you're probably going to have to think about the action, because you might, with heavier strings, want to adjust the action. If you've been using lighter strings with a very low action, you might then suddenly find that you're getting a little bit of fret buzz. So being able to adjust the action is another consideration, and how easy or difficult that is to do, again, is another factor of the type of bridge setup that you've got. But then it also links into being able to adjust the truss rod, which you may have to do as well in terms of adjusting that action. So another thing to think about is how easy or difficult is that to do? How accessible is the truss rod on your guitar? Some are super accessible, like the Fender type guitars with the sort of little bullet shaped hole at the kind of headstock end on the more modern Fender guitars. Do you require a special tool to adjust the truss rod? Did it come with the guitar? Or do you have to get a specialist tool in order to be able to do that? These, again, are considerations that aren't really brought up very often. So another one of those, for example, is how easy or difficult it is to adjust the intonation of a guitar. So again, once you've changed your strings, and maybe you've changed the action, adjusted the truss rod, you also need to check, when you've brought those strings up to tune, then is the guitar also in tune with itself? So that's the intonation. When you fret the note at the 12th fret, is the pitch of that note the same pitch as the open string? And if not, you will need to make an adjustment to the intonation. And again, that is different on different types of guitars. And again, it probably comes down to the type of bridge unit that you've got. Some are far easier than others. What type of screws do you have to adjust on the bridge unit? And is it just an ordinary sort of screwdriver that you need, or do you need a very, very tiny one? Or do you need a tiny, tiny little Allen key? These are all things that I think you should really look at when you are buying a guitar, to determine, how easy or difficult that guitar is going to be to live with and use and play. So to give you an example, I'm going to rate each of my guitars, including the one I made just for fun, see how it turns out, on a scale of 1 to 5, in each of the areas that I've just mentioned, and we'll see how it turns out. The first one of my guitars that I'm going to give a rating to is the Ibanez RG550, which, as you all know, has got a Floyd Rose. And I'm just going to say straight off the bat that this guitar scores 5 out of 5 in terms of level of difficulty in all of these areas. Am I being fair? Or do I just find this particularly painful? No, I think it's fair. I think this is genuinely extremely difficult. So when you want to change the strings, you've got a locking nut there. Okay, so that's got to be, undone with an Allen key. Then all the little bits fall off. So the little screws and the locking bits fall off. So you've got to put those somewhere where you're not going to lose them for a start. And the trick that I've been told anyway is that really you should do this you should change one string at a time. Now, if you're a beginner and you're not very experienced and you just want to change your strings, logically you think the first step is to remove the old strings. So you might get some string cutters and snip them all and take them off. And then what will happen is that you'll lose, obviously any loss of string tension, because this whole Floyd Rose system is about balancing the tension, between the springs in the back and the strings. So once you remove any of that tension, then the whole setup is lost completely. So in order to maintain the tension, you have to do one string at a time, right? But if you don't know that and no one tells you that, then you're going to have an uphill struggle if you take all the strings off and then put them back on. Because then what you're going to have to do is try to tighten up the strings, tune up the strings, and then what will happen, you'll find, is that the Floyd Rose will sit up like this. So then you'll have to adjust the screws in the back that hold the springs to try and pull the bridge back to sit it back down again. Then, of course, the strings will be out of tune, so you have to tune those again, and then you'll have the same issue, and you will just have to keep doing that over and over and over again until you get the Floyd Rose sitting where you want it, which is kind of sat down kind of flat like this, and the strings in tune again, so that you can then replace the locking nut. And I think the other thing that I should have said is along with how easy or difficult is it to change the strings, how easy or difficult is it to do an alternative tuning? So even as straightforward as something like drop D, that is really not very easy on this guitar. If I was going to do that, I have to unlock the locking nut, detune to drop D, and get my Allen key again and lock it back down again. So that's not a quick and easy thing to do either. And if you wanted to do a whole alternative tuning like E flat, which is a really common one, then again, you're taking off all the bits of the locking nut, retuning it, and then locking it back down again. So, okay, maybe not too difficult, but it's a bit involved. So adjusting the action is a whole topic in itself in terms of setting up the action on this guitar with the Floyd Rose. Everything that you do is kind of part of it. So getting the Floyd to sit so that it's level with the guitar is part of it, and that involves adjusting the springs in the back as well. you can sort of use these two screws here. So you just get your Allen key, and you can adjust sort of like the bridge height using the Allen key and those two screws there. But that isn't in any way the whole story of setting the action on this guitar, and I've made an entire video about it, so I'm not going to go into it really. It's just 5 out of 5 in terms of difficulty getting the action right on this guitar. If you just need to make small adjustments to the tuning, then the point of the locking nut is that you then don't use the tuning pegs, you use the fine tuners down here to do that. And to be fair, that is actually pretty effective. That does actually work quite well. Then in terms of adjusting the truss rod, that is not too difficult. You have this truss rod cover, which I can't get the camera to focus on, but you have a few little tiny screws there, which you need to unscrew to get the cover off to access the truss rod. So it's a little bit more involved, I suppose, than a lot of guitars. So I'd give that probably a 3 out of 5 in terms of difficulty. Adjusting the intonation. So again, here you've got to do that on the Floyd Rose. It is tricky. It's very fiddly. I'm going to give that a 5 out of 5. Overall, tricky, fiddly, and not something that I was really that aware of when I first got the guitar. And it's definitely something that makes me very, very wary about getting another guitar with a Floyd Rose in particular. So let's see how my other guitars stack up against this one. The next guitar I'm going to give a rating to and some scores to is my PRS SE Tremonti. It's really a super simple guitar. It hasn't given me a lot of issues, to be honest, in the 20 odd years that I've owned it. However, there are some things that make it a bit less simple than it might appear on the surface of things. So, number one, restringing the guitar. Super easy, barely an inconvenience. Because you have this stop tailpiece bridge. There's no trem unit or anything like that. The strings just go through the bridge and back over. And then you just wind them round the tuners, tune it up, and you're all done. When you're doing drop D or a different tuning, E flat or anything like that, you just use the tuning pegs to do that. It's not really a problem at all. However, if you want to change the string gauge, so I'm a fan of using the top light, bottom heavy strings on this guitar, and I have had a few issues with fret buzz, so I've had to kind of get it checked out and have a couple of truss rod adjustments, and that's not really something that I've been prepared to do myself. It's slightly trickier in that you need to have the PRS truss rod tool in order to do it, which is just an Allen key, but I found that none of the Allen keys that I had at home were right for this. You have to take off the truss rod cover. There's a little screw there for removing that. And then, yeah, you need to have the PRS truss rod tool to adjust it. But it's not too difficult. So I'm going to say for restringing, it gets 1 out of 5 because it's super simple. Adjusting the truss rod, I'd say 2, because you've got a cover to take off and you need to have the right tool. Most of the time it does come with the guitar. I suspect I did have one, but subsequently lost it at some point. So that's on me, I guess, but I'm still going to give it 2. The third thing that you're going to want to do is look at the action. This is pretty straightforward. So again, with the stop tailpiece bridge, you've just got these 2 screws, and on the PRS website it says you can use a quarter to turn these screws. But yeah, just a kind of wide flathead screwdriver will probably do the job just fine. So yeah, that's very easy. I'm going to give that a 1 out of 5. Because again, the great thing is it's all in one piece, so you're adjusting all the strings at the same time. Adjusting the intonation is interesting. So when I first looked at it, and I have to say I've not ever really had an issue with the intonation of this guitar, but if I did, when I was looking at how would you actually adjust it, because on first glance there's nothing to adjust. You can't move the individual strings. So I had to do a little bit of research, and I found that there are these little sort of Allen key, tiny little Allen key sort of holes at each end of the bridge, and you can adjust these if you have the correct size Allen key. So you've got to find one that fits. But then I guess it's fairly straightforward, because you're kind of moving the whole thing as a unit. You're not doing the individual strings. You just do the bass and treble ends, and the other strings, in theory, will fall into place and your intonation will be correct. I've never tried this because, as I say, I've never had a problem with the intonation of this guitar. But I think that is actually a little bit fiddly. So I'm going to give that a 3 out of 5 for difficulty, I think, on the intonation. So yeah, that's the PRS. It's pretty simple to own and maintain. And you probably won't have issues with intonation. But if you do and you need to adjust it, not as straightforward as you might think. Next up, we've got the Squier Strat. So not the most straightforward and simple guitar, actually. Even though we tend to think of these as the archetypal beginner's guitar, there are a few things that make it maybe a little bit more complicated than, say, my PRS. And one of those actually is changing the strings. Because it's a floating trem, so it's got a tremolo unit, the way that the strings are set up is a through the body thing, where you've got to kind of thread them through here. Not that that makes it especially or particularly difficult, it's just, it's not as immediately visually obvious, I suppose, and it's just slightly more technical. So for somebody who's just started playing the guitar, they might not realise like where the strings actually go and how you have to change them. But yeah, then, you know, you just wind them around the tuning pegs. Make sure you get them under the string guides or string trees. And believe me, I've done that before, like completely missed them, just not really paying attention to what I've been doing, and then started kind of trying to tune it up, and then realised that, yeah, I hadn't got them underneath the string trees. So that's something to watch out for as well. So I'm going to give this a 2 out of 5 because it is that little bit more difficult and not as obvious to know how to actually change the strings. But then once they're on, in terms of tunings and doing alternative tunings, you just wind the tuning pegs. That it's not particularly difficult to do. So that's why we're going to leave it at a 2. Then if you have changed the string gauge, which you might want to do, that might necessitate you having to adjust the truss rod. And I'm going to give this a 1 out of 5 for truss rod adjustment. The Fender style guitars are probably the easiest guitars on this front. So there's the hole where you can access the truss rod. So that's quite simple. So I'm going to give that, 1 out of 5. If you need to adjust the action, again, we have a guitar with a floating bridge and a trem unit, which means you've got springs in the back. And again, you have some of the issues that you have with the Floyd Rose. It's not as difficult to adjust, but it is a bit of a pain and a bit of a faff, really. So I'm going to give that maybe a 3 out of 5 to adjust the action on this kind of bridge. But then when you're adjusting the intonation, that's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You've got the screws just here, so it's just a case of, getting a very tiny little small screwdriver and adjusting each of the saddles in order to make sure that each string, has the right intonation. So I think that is pretty straightforward. You do have to do each string separately. I think that is a bonus because that means you can make sure that each string is accurate. So I'm going to give that a 1 out of 5 because that's very easy to do. Next, we've got the Squier Thinline Telecaster. In general terms, it's a pretty simple guitar in terms of owning and maintenance. Not a lot can go wrong with it. You've got a through the body string setup, so you just pop them through and they go kind of through and over the saddles. And then the brilliant bit is that you've got these tuners which are fantastic. So you just cut off the excess of the string, you pop the end into a little hole in the tuning head, you wind it around, and then you don't get those awful sticky outy pokey string ends on there. It's nice and tidy, and it's just really, really easy to do. And I think the fact that I've had this guitar for just under a year, about 10 months I think, and I've had maybe 3 or 4 sets of strings on there, kind of reflects the fact that it takes me 5 minutes max to do a string change on this guitar, which is absolutely brilliant. It's just a joy, to be honest. I've been able to try out different string gauges on here and see what works best for me. So that's been excellent. So I'm going to give that a 1 out of 5. And similarly for doing alternative tunings, you just use the tuning pegs and you're there, you're good to go. So that's no problem at all. 1 out of 5. Adjusting the truss rod, you've got the access at the headstock end as you have on most sort of modern Fenders, and you just use an Allen key, so that's a 1 out of 5. Pretty simple, no problem at all. Adjusting the action is easy enough in terms of it being straightforward, but you do have to do each string independently. So you just use a little tiny screwdriver to move the height of the string saddles. But because it's a radiused fretboard, you might want to have each string sitting, at a slightly different height to reflect that kind of fretboard radius, so the position of the string relative to the fretboard. So it's a little bit more involved, and you're gonna need to spend a little bit more time doing it. So I'm going to give that, I think, a 3 out of 5. But the intonation is very straightforward. Again, you've just got the screws there that you can use to move the saddles either way as necessary, just with a little tiny screwdriver. So I'm going to give that 1 out of 5 for adjusting the intonation. The Rickenbacker, I am not so sure about other than changing the strings. So changing the strings is a tiny bit fiddly. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 5 because you've got to get kind of like underneath, sort of in under here, to start threading the strings through. Then you've got to kind of thread them through the bridge and like get them in the middle, in the center of the saddle. And then it's just kind of winding it around the tuning pegs as normal. So no string trees or string guides or anything, because you've got the 3-a-side headstock. So they kind of stay nice and straight. But yeah, I'm going to give that a 2 out of 5 because it's not as easy as some of my other guitars to restring. But once the strings are on there, doing different tunings is no problem. So we'll just sort of keep that as a 2. Adjusting the truss rod. So you've got the truss rod cover there, which has got the Rickenbacker logo on it. So you'll need to take out 3 screws, and I don't actually know whether you need a special tool or not. I suspect that you probably do, because these are, they're quite specialised. So I suspect that you need an adjustment tool, and I suspect that I have got that adjustment tool in the hard case that it came in. But I've never had to use it. This neck is straight. Never had any issues. Whatever strings I've put on it, the neck has stayed straight. I've never had any fret buzz or anything like that. So I've never even attempted to adjust the truss rod. I've never needed to. Adjusting the action, a fairly straightforward job, really. It's just a couple of little screws on each side of that bridge, which you can sort of move up and down depending on how you want the action to sit. I'm going to give that 1 out of 5. It's really not difficult to do. And I think the advantage really being that, you do it kind of all as one block kind of thing, a bit like with the PRS. So that's a very straightforward adjustment to make. If you want to adjust the intonation, again, that's quite straightforward. You've got the screws there to move the saddles backwards and forwards. It's just going to be a little bit physically difficult because you've got this stop tail piece. That's going to make it fiddly to get in there with the little screwdriver in there. And with the Rick, you've got to worry about damaging the finish. So when you're coming at your guitar with like sharp objects like screwdrivers, that makes me very, 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 very nervous. So although it's like not technically difficult to not scratch your guitar and everything, it's fiddly. So I'm going to give the intonation adjustment a 3 out of 5 for that reason. Last but not least, I'm going to look at the guitar that I made myself and see whether I've set myself up for an easy life or not. And I think in general I did, really. Not that that was much of a consideration. I designed it more around the sort of tone and sound that I wanted it to have, and the inspiration, from the different kind of players that I loved at the time and their kind of signature guitars. So I wasn't really thinking too much about this, but there are some things that I'm glad that I decided. So in terms of changing the strings, very, very easy. There's a kind of tune-o-matic, like Gibson style bridge there with the kind of tailpiece that you put the strings through, sit them over the saddles. And again, I've gone with the kind of 3-a-side headstock so that the strings stay straight and you don't need string guides, and just wind them around tuners, no problem. So that is a 1 out of 5. Again, if you want to change the tuning, you just use the tuning pegs, 1 out of 5. The truss rod adjustment is interesting. You can't, is the answer. I sort of use a square cross section of a steel rod, basically, and glued it in. So that is glued into the neck. And the theory is that the neck will stay straight. It will never ever bend or warp. And in the, almost 30 years since I made this guitar, the neck has stayed perfectly straight. So I think that worked. I don't know what I would have done if it hadn't worked. I guess that would have been a problem, because I'd be sort of unable to play it either because of incurable fret buzz, or it would never, you'd never be able to get the intonation right. But that was luckily a gamble that paid off. So I've never needed to adjust the truss rod, and I don't have to worry about it. So I'm going to give that 1 out of 5. To adjust the action, very easy with this sort of tune-o-matic bridge, as you can see. You don't need a tool, you don't need a screwdriver, you don't need anything. You can do it manually. You can move the bridge height up and down. So I'm going to give that like a 1 out of 5, because you can really do that in a matter of minutes. Adjusting the intonation, slightly more fiddly. You do need a screwdriver. You do need to kind of be able to move those saddles backwards and forwards as needed. So maybe a 2 out of 5 on that. But in general, this has probably been the lowest maintenance guitar that I've ever owned. So, there have been advantages to the way I've designed it, and I've been very, very, very happy with it over the years. As we've seen, guitars can vary quite substantially in terms of the relative difficulty of doing some of the most basic things that you all need to do when you own a guitar. I'm going to go through the scoring now. So in last place, as it were, if we're saying we want a guitar that is easy to own and maintain, it won't be a surprise to anyone that my Ibanez RG550 finished last with a score of 18 out of 20. So that just kind of shows, how much I didn't know and didn't realise when I got that guitar when I was 18. And, if you are someone who's prepared to put in some work, and I know a lot of people are, and you want to learn more about guitars, that's brilliant. Just go into it with your eyes open, knowing that that is what you're going to have to do. It's not a guitar, and any guitar like it with a Floyd Rose isn't something that I might necessarily suggest or recommend to someone who's just starting out. If they just want a guitar that's nice to play and is going to be very easy to restring and stuff. The next, in terms of level of difficulty, I suppose, was actually the Rickenbacker. And again, I think that's no real surprise. It's quite a specialist kind of instrument. It's slightly different from a lot of other guitars in a lot of ways, so it doesn't really surprise me. However, that got 8 out of 20, so there's a massive jump there of 10 points between kind of the most difficult and then the next most difficult. So yeah, miles and miles easier than the Ibanez. And then actually a couple of my guitars got 7 out of 20, so only very slightly less difficult really than the Rickenbacker. So both the Squier Strat and the PRS both got 7 out of 20. I think because these both on the surface appear to be very simple guitars, but you have a couple of things that make them a little bit tricky. And then we have the Squier Thinline Telly, which got 6 out of 20. Nice, simple, straightforward stuff there. Most straightforward guitar in terms of having to do any of these things: restringing, adjusting truss rod, adjusting the action and the intonation, is the guitar that I made myself, and that scored 5 out of 20. But I actually think that's cheating a little bit, because you can't even adjust the truss rod on that one. So I think I probably cheated a little bit there. And out of the sort of types of guitar that are commercially available, of the ones that I own, I'd say the Telly style guitar is the easiest. So there you go. Those are my thoughts and conclusions. Do you think there are any guitars that are easier even than a Telly to own? Or, do you think actually, if you're getting into playing guitar, that you should actually learn more about guitars and how they work, and be able to kind of do a lot of these things yourself, no matter what type of guitar you have? I think a lot of these things depend on your interests and whether you're just in it for the music and the sort of creativity of just wanting to play it, and not necessarily being too bothered about how it works and knowing all the geeky stuff about how to mess around with it and do what you need to do. Or is there something there about, it comes with the territory of being a guitarist? Be interested to know your thoughts. As always, let me know in the comments, and thanks a lot for watching.